مرحبا للجميع. I'll start by an English introduction and then Arabic introduction will follow. My name is Ahmed Yassin from the public program at the Abdul Mohsen Qattan Foundation. Allow me to welcome PhD candidate Suzannah Henty on behalf of the foundation, who will be presenting our lecture today, and also welcome you all for being here. Suzannah Henty is a Melbourne, Paris-based Australian art historian, writer and educator. She's currently undertaking a jointly awarded and cross-disciplinary PhD at the University of Melbourne and the École des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales. So, a little bit of French, huh? Her research is concerned with the destabilisation of settler colonial discourses by means of resistance and contemporary art practices. She's published in many articles, including Jerusalem Quarterly, and she's also worked with Al-Ma'mal Art Foundation. She's been teaching many courses at University of Melbourne, and also she's been given a guest lecturer at Victoria University and SOAS University of London. The Abdul Mohsen Qattan Foundation actually is interested in hosting different speakers and also conducting different events of lectures, speeches, and talks to try to shed the light on different topics that are important for the Palestinian context, and also try to have bridges and communication between the international experiences and the Palestinians, hosting international speakers where we can discuss and also broaden the knowledge of topics that could be similar. For example, the lecture that Ms. Hent will be talking about in a bit is also concerned about colonialism and, of course, the Palestinian cause in general. We'll be very happy to present the lecture that is entitled Oral History and Radical Future. The lecture explores a subject of courage, resilience, resistance, as read through a selection of contemporary artists working with video and film in Palestine. The lecture tries to examine the relationship that landscape shares with past and present conflicts. اسمحوا لي أنتقل للتقديم باللغة العربية عشان نكون عادلين. اسمي أحمد ياسين من البرنامج العام بمؤسسة القطان. بنرحب بطالبة الدكتوراه سوزان هنتي، وبرحب فيكم أيضا. شكرا على حضوركم. سوزان هنتي هي مؤرخة فنية أسترالية مقيمة ما بين باريس وملبورن. هي كاتبة ومعلمة وبتدرس الدكتوراه ببرنامج مشترك ما بين جامعة ملبورن وما بين جامعة الدراسات المتقدمة للعلوم بجامعة باريس. هذا الاسم الطويل اللي بالفرنسي شوي عرفت أقرأه. البحث تبعها بيركز على زعزعة الخطاب الاستعماري والاستيطاني عن طريق المقاومة من خلال ممارسات الفن المعاصر. لها العديد من المنشورات بكثير مجلات، منها جيروسلم كوارترلي، وكمان اشتغلت باحثة بمتحف مدينة العمارة في باريس ومؤسسة المعمل للفن المعاصر. كمان قامت بتدريس عدة مساقات بجامعة ملبورن، وكانت ضيفة زائرة بفيكتوريا وبجامعة ساوث بلندن. الهدف الأساسي من استضافة مؤسسة القطان لمحاضرين وندوات وورشات عمل مختلفة إنه نطرح مواضيع بتهتم بالشأن الفلسطيني، وكمان نساعد بإنتاج معرفة معينة اللي نقدر نتطرق لهاي المواضيع من وجهات نظر دولية مختلفة، ونشوف كيف مرات الناس بتطلعوا على القضية الفلسطينية من وجهة نظرهم، وكيف نقدر نربط مواضيع مختلفة تتعلق بالكولونيالية والاحتلال ما بين دول عالم آخر وما بين فلسطين. بسعدنا نقدم محاضرة بعنوان التاريخ الشفوي والمستقبل الراديكالي اليوم، والمحاضرة بتتطرق لموضوع الشجاعة، الصمود والمقاومة، كيف شافتها مجموعة محددة من الفنانين الفلسطينيين والأستراليين اللي كانوا عم بيشتغلوا بمجال الفن والأفلام، صناعة الأفلام والفيديو. شكرا جزيلا لكم. بحب I'd like to welcome you, Miss Susan, to present the lecture.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the foundation, thanks to Johnny, thanks to Mahmoud, everybody for coming. And I'm really happy to be here. I first came to Palestine in 2016, where I was working for Colonial International, working on the Jerusalem show. So the talk is divided roughly into two sections, and the first part is a self-reflexive critique on what I had initially planned to discuss. And the second section, I look at contemporary art specifically, and looking at the work of Larissa Sansur and Hannah Bronte and how they visualize the dislocation of Indigenous sovereignty through the imposition of a heteropatriarchal Western notion of statehood. So I initially planned to talk about the examples where cultural centres have been destroyed in settled estates, or as well as the appropriation and the absorption of Indigenous culture through the institution. And I gave a couple of testimonies describing the impact of this destruction on the community and how the destruction accentuates the role of culture as a form of resistance and how it's perceived as a threat by the occupier. And I examined Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which forbids collective punishment, and argued that these cases were acts of cultural genocide that are punishable by international law. But I decided not to begin with these cases for two reasons. And the first reason is that settler colonial governance is, by its definition, a violation of international law. And we need to start here in this discourse with this truth. And by settler colonial governance, this is the Jerusalem show in 2014. So yeah, by settler colonial governance, I mean those systems of legal, social, political, and cultural administration that are used by the nation state and that are the legacy of the settler colonies in their present-day occupation of lands belonging to and appropriated from Indigenous peoples. And I'm calling to mind the work of Patrick Wolfe and the logic of native elimination. Is that better? Okay. So, moreover, the 4 treaties and 3 protocols that have established the standards of international law for humanitarian treatment in war and which constitute the Geneva Convention, as we know, are not legally binding. And to add more to this paradox of humanitarian treatment in war, I'm questioning what war we're talking about. And I'm uncertain about legitimizing an opposition rather than emphasizing an illegal occupier, as well as I am for wanting to recognize the ignored massacres in the triumphalist histories of the West, and I'm thinking specifically about the frontier wars in Australia. And these are some reproductions of the massacres that occurred across Australia. This is a protest to remember the frontier wars. So likewise, we know that customary law is based on consent between internationally recognized states. More often than not, but certainly in the case of Australia, the members of the United Nations who consent or dissent to this international customary law have appropriated and absorbed the sovereign status of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are resultantly considered internal populations and therefore putative citizens. But this citizen status, and actually this is an example of the assimilation policies in Australia. This is before 1967. 1967, there was a referendum to include Aboriginal people into the Constitution, and this sort of exemplifies the forms of assimilation that were happening, where there was the claim that there will be no full-blood Aboriginal people, and there will be ultimate absorption by the people of the Commonwealth. So the citizen status itself is a crime. It's the imposition of citizenship to the settler state, which is a form of assimilation, and the imposition of apartheid policies, which is elimination. So the logic of settler colonialism is manifested as genocidal by its very structure. An exception to customary law is peremptory norms or compelling law. But we know that there has been no international intervention to continue the violation of either customary or compelling law in Palestine or Australia. There is no real legal implication of the violation of peremptory law, and historically states have not voided treaties that have violated compelling law. as the Vienna Convention has resolved that they must do, and where the state in question has pirated international law to serve the purposes of their occupation, the law of state responsibility cannot be depended upon either. So moving towards transnational solidarity between communities of people as a practice and as a theoretical framework that may see through intersectional liberation, I believe can counter the ineffectiveness of international law, which depends upon nation statehood as a liberatory model. And the second reason that I didn't start with looking at the destruction of cultural sites is that I didn't want to start a talk looking at decolonial futures through the discourse of trauma. My reason for this is that I'm not interested in forms of resistance that frame self-determination and sovereignty as motivations that follow occupation. Indigenous sovereignty has been consistently framed within the context of conflict and not beyond the paradigm of modernity. Not as sovereign peoples who have been, that the international community constituted by nation states has failed to recognize because of its very structure. So resistance in the settler colonial state, I believe, is a necessary practice to counter the occupier's design for Indigenous erasure. While, of course, Indigenous resistance supposes that there is an opposition, emphasizing in our theoretical discourse that the right to self-determination, to family, to love, and to integrity precedes occupation for them, and this is the motivation for resistance, not the trauma that has been inflicted by the occupation, which would in turn center the triumphalist narratives that the occupiers claim. So as a methodological exercise, the way we frame resistance also frames our calls for decolonization. The role that art has in imagining alternative futures should not be underestimated or overlooked in the discourses of decolonization. When the national priorities serve to uphold the grand narratives of the state and its prosperity, art can obstruct these triumphalist histories by producing counter-hegemonic imaginaries of the future. And so now I'm going to start the second part of the talk by looking at the work of Hannah Bronte and Larissa Sansor. But again, I have revised what I was going to say. Originally, I had focused specifically on the oral aspect of the film, arguing that the presence of Indigenous voices in both films, the artists were demanding that the viewers listen to the Indigenous voice, which is an important aspect of decolonial thinking, where the silencing of Indigenous voices has been instantiated into law and the visualization of the black body has been subject to biofrontier homicide through miscegenation policies. And I want to emphasize in Australia, this was through the breeding out of blackness. This was a policy in Australia where the Aboriginal female body was seen as a conduit to whiten the nation, as well as mass executions. The action of listening implored upon the viewer by these works is a decolonial gesture that's been prompted by the videos. But as I reflected further on the ineffectiveness of international law and the emphasis of transnationalism emphasized in these works, it became more important to emphasize this issue. And what happens when I continue to say the settler state, I'm maintaining the sovereign status of Indigenous peoples as lesser than the occupier, rather than centering Indigenous sovereignty, which is narrated within the films. I maintain the modern epistemologies of epistemologies of statehood as an essentialized and inescapable paradigm by defining sovereignty in a way that continually returns the articulation of power to the colonizer. So now I will turn to the art. Larissa Sansor's, actually, can we watch the 1 minute of Larissa Sansor's, just so we can see the sort of the visuals of it?
صار يكتشفوها رح تكون هي برهان على إنه هذا الشعب اللي إحنا عم نطرحه اليوم كان موجود. فإذا في المستقبل الناس رح تكتشف إنه حضارتك هاي
أهلك كانوا يأكلوا من أرقى أنواع الخبز؟
مزبوط وقتها بس القيامة ما بتصير في لحظة زمن.
And the next artist that I will look at, but I will introduce her now, it's Hannah Bronte. She's a Meanjin-born artist, and she rejects the colonial nationality and her family name, denying the legitimacy of what it actually means to be Australian. But Larissa Sansor's film, In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain, actually now I'm going to introduce them both. I'm reading my text, I'm sorry. And Ahmed's Tongue, the artists problematize the logic of sovereignty through an eco-feminist critique on nationhood and its heteropatriarchal origins, through constituting sovereignty as a relationship between the body and land, which is not a controversial claim at all, an argument that asserts the dispossession and the reappropriation of land as a form of genocide is mounted. But by situating the films in the future, the artists anticipate an approaching landscapes in efforts to counter-appropriate and, in a sense, caution against the destructive forms of Western possession. Through interrogating the process through which the modern nation-state is established, Larissa Sansor's film, In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain, counter-appropriates the appropriation of historical narratives by the occupier to legitimize the illegal settlement. The film alternates between a post-apocalyptic desertscape and an empty black abyss in which the protagonist stands. A voice-over consultation between a psychiatrist and a Palestinian freedom fighter who is described as a narrative terrorist is had, while we see images of changing landscapes that include archival images of Ottoman Palestine, Mandate Palestine, refugee camps, Bedouin figures, and two sisters. While set in the future, which is something we'll discuss later, the struggle for Palestinian liberation is at the fore of the protagonist's struggle, who is working towards establishing a de facto nation through intervening with the past to bury a to-be heritage. The very setting of the film, a post-apocalyptic near future, has been called a form of counter-history making, and this is the sort of counter-appropriation of archives, which has been happening a lot in contemporary practices. But what Larissa Sansor is doing is creating a counter-futurist articulation. This is what it's been argued. However, I think this counter-futurist utopia preceded this imagined apocalypse is far too optimistic. And I think what Larissa Sansor is doing is much more complex than this, especially if we acknowledge the tragedy of needing a future heritage to justify a nation, which I think complicates the call for the right to return. At one point, the protagonist states, "Our lives have been already determined by a fiction forced upon us. Our rulers unsee anything inconsistent with their own truth. They only see us when we rebel. In times of silence, we cease to exist." This is here. The protagonist appropriates the myth-making processes in the establishment of the nation-state by intervening with what Larissa Sansor calls the future perception of a territory's political history, by concealing artifacts for archaeologists to excavate in the future. The buried artifacts are porcelain plates marked with the keffiyeh pattern, the motif of the keffiyeh. Not only does Sansor evoke the work of anthropologist Professor Nadia Abu al-Hajj, who writes that the national hobby of Israel has been archaeology and deployed as a form of national self-fashioning, which has in turn facilitated the territorial expansion and appropriation, but also following Derrida, the absurdity of legal arguments and authority of law that has defined statehood in the first instance. The counter-future in which the freedom fighter is engaging is not necessarily optimistic. It does not solve the epistemic question of how history is written, for whom it's written, and with what effect, specifically in relation to Indigenous rights. In interrogating the process through which the state is produced through appropriation, the protagonist addresses this epistemic question of nationhood by stating, and this is here, by projecting a state into the past supports the idea of historical entitlement. In its most perverted form, archaeology galvanizes public sentiment, confirms myths of the past, and defends them against scrutiny. It's here. Here, it's an important moment in the film when the protagonist rejects the psychologist's argument that there will be no descendants to claim the archaeology because of its fiction that the Fedayeen is making, the freedom fighter is making. But the freedom fighter argues that myth does not only create fact, it creates identification. How the individual subject, the body of any nation state, internalizes and in so doing legitimizes the myths of a nation to cultivate a sense of belonging is a tragic theme, I think, of the film. And I believe that Sansour's freedom fighter is hinting at the traps within modernity, questioning whether or not such a counter-appropriation will see through liberty, or will the methods of modernity perpetuate cultural genocide? Perhaps in the future, Larissa Sansour is giving us a better understanding of the paradoxes of recognizing Indigenous sovereignty in modernity rather than imagining a liberated future. But perhaps more optimistically, the film is considering liberation beyond the prism of ethnocentricity, in that if a nation can build through self-identification, what can a decolonized state look like? And this is in particular concerning notions of sovereignty, the right to return from exile, from diaspora, and for non-Palestinian asylum seekers, for example. So if Larissa Sansour's film addresses the mechanics of the nation state through myth-making, Hannah Bronte's addresses how Indigenous sovereignty is erased through the model of modernity and implores a reconsideration of future nationhood by visualizing what we face with climate disaster and emphasizing such disaster as a result of the heteropatriarchal modern Western hegemony. And we'll just watch maybe 2 minutes of Hannah Bronte's film so you can see the sort of what's going on.
Woken from a slumber, arisen to this plunder. My anger roars in thunder, my command you are under. I need no introduction, yeah, your mind it cannot function. You shot off your higher selves, you're a slithering for wealth. Well, I'm a snake charmer, I'll build you with more armor. Yet your mother, you would harm her, yet your mother, you would harm her. Dina, Gaia, Oma, Ina, Aka and Maka. Welcome to the welcome to the
So, Bronte's work uses sound, music, rap, and hip-hop in particular, alongside futurist representations of the landscape to speak simultaneously to female solidarity and empowerment, environmental disaster, and colonization. The didactics of the Institute of Modern Art in Brisbane, where it was exhibited in 2018, stated that the word ama, or mother, repeated by a cast of Indigenous female rappers, calls upon the matriarchal figure of nature in resistance to a dystopian landscape of human industry. But if we follow Aileen Moreton Robinson's definition of Indigenous sovereignty as an ontological connection to country, I believe that the film doesn't only call upon the matriarchal figure of nature as a transnational, a transcultural, and a transracial figure, but also visualizes Aboriginal sovereign warrior women, which is a term that has been coined by a scholar named Tracy Bunda. However, because the women who stand before the several contrasting landscapes, where the seemingly untouched forestscapes clash with the cityscapes, with mining sites, with planets of burning lava, ruined buildings, and beachscapes, the film equally appeals for action to addressing how all humankind will be impacted by the effects of human industry. And this is addressed in the narrative when Amma states, "My power knows no equal, for I bore all walks of people." So in this sense, there are two matters that are at play in the film, specifically concerning landscape. The first, which is Indigenous sovereignty, and the second, which is transnational, transcultural, and transracial futurity. So in the first instance, in visualizing Indigenous sovereignty as simultaneously a subject and a place, the women rap "I am Amma" as if to be a sovereign space, and to say "welcome to the Amma" as if it's a place. Bronte targets the myth of terra nullius by decentering the capitalist conceptions of Western sovereignty through private land ownership and belonging. Indeed, the deployment of terra nullius, which was the legal argument for the settlement of Australia in 1788, terra nullius meaning land belonging to nobody, as in there is no sovereign, indelibly impacted Indigenous sovereignty through mass displacement. Indigenous sovereignty, Professor Aileen Moreton Robinson defines this by saying that the legal regime, so I'm quoting, "The legal regime of the nation state places Indigenous people in a state of homelessness because of our ontological relationship to land, which is the way we hold title." And then explaining settler belonging, Moreton Robinson argues that settler attachment to land is, quote, "derived from ownership and an achievement that is inextricably linked to racialized social status that confers certain privileges, a social status that is enhanced by a version of the Australian history that privileges the exploits of white Australians by representing them as people who made this country what it is today," end quote. Through the women rapping with children in their arms, Bronte centres sovereign Aboriginal women as the key figures of resistance and the conduits for Indigenous futurity, while underscoring that women have been subject to and are still targeted by colonisation, following colonisation in 1788, and also the establishment of the Australian state was in 1901. The imposition of a heteropatriarchal system of capitalist exploitation, Aboriginal women have been subject to horrific forms of biopolitical control, including rape, and I explained earlier the miscegenation policies and the breeding out of blackness, having children forcibly removed, placed into church missions and state reserves, and various assimilation policies. Yet Bronte's film celebrates Aboriginal women and emphasises their strength in resisting the colonial project of native elimination. The second aspect of the film is the transnational threat of climate disaster and the impossibility of broaching this issue through the law of state responsibility. In response to the results of human industry, the figures of Amma rap, "As my children attack me, frack me, I am the innovator of all life's creator, so I shall be your emancipator. So whether we consider sovereignty through the prism of Western modernity, i.e. settler nationalism, which is, again quoting Robinson, defined as a sense of belonging derived from ownership as understood through the logic of capital, or opposingly Indigenous sovereignty, the ontological connection to country, which is constituted through home and place, the custodial relationships with land, with waterway, with sky, with plants and animals, and thus something that cannot be ceded but rather disrupted by patriarchal sovereignty. It will inevitably be impacted by climate disaster. In discourses of in discourses of decolonisation, this is something that I think is underexplored, and indeed in the field of environmental justice, the complexity of the relationship between the nation state and colonisation is equally underexplored, and I think this is something that these artists do by disrupting the decolonial theory. But so now I'm going to finish so we can talk a little bit and have questions, which is considering what's radical about these films. What's perhaps most radical in Sansor and Bronte's film is that they actually produce post-colonial imaginaries. And by this I don't mean that Sansor and Bronte imagined the post-colonial liberatory narrative that was imagined by the post-colonial thinkers of the late 20th century. These films are too honest to consider the post-colony as a utopian space. They imagine the apocalypse that will follow the ongoing Western cultural, political, and global economic hegemony. And in this sense, the artists challenge the assumptions of the national histories as well as liberatory models that have been put forward through decolonial thinking. And this has probably to do with the United Nations as well, with their granting of the independence to colonial countries in 1960, which says that colonization is illegal and that all countries should have the right to decolonization. But this is something that we have not seen in settler colonial states. So I'm going to end with Omike Baba, who wrote in 1990 that nations, like narratives, lose their origins in the myths of time and only fully realize their horizons in the mind's eye. Larissa Sansor and Hannah Bronte adopt the post-colonial discourse but turn it on its head and warn against the simplicity of current decolonial theory, alerting the viewers to the perversities and the pervasiveness of occupation and its complexity, and center sovereign Indigenous women as the key conduits for liberation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Susan, again. Let's welcome Lara Khaldi one more time. Again, head of media studies at Bard University and a curator to do the discussion of the lecture.
I wanted to maybe start. I was struck by how you kind of talk about how you changed your mind about this talk, right? And about how you decided not to use this the framework of law and legality in looking at the destruction of cultural spaces, but also of reading the colonial project, right? Or delegitimizing the colonial project. And I just wanted to echo that we have this ongoing debate here, right, about the use of law and legality as a tool and a language to resist the occupation, the settler colonialism with, but also in terms of aesthetics and art as well. So I was thinking about, for example, a discussion, ongoing discussion about forensic architecture and their work, but in particular about this work by Lawrence Abu Hamdan, where he makes a video that Amnesty International also uses about two young men who were shot by the Israeli military during the Nakba commemoration a few years ago, and where the Israeli military, of course, says that they were shot by Palestinian arms, which, of course, we all know that they were shot by Israelis. But Lawrence Abu Hamdan goes to investigate the sound of the bullets, and proves through sound, through analysis of sound, that those bullets were coming from Israeli military. And this video is used by Amnesty International. And of course, the debate and the discussion is that, of course, we know, right, that these two young men were killed by the Israeli military. Using the language of law is, it's being used by the colonizer and by occupation. It's inventing and reinventing itself, right? But there's, on the other hand, there is also there are many colleagues of opinions where they say that legality and law help us survive. So there have been cases where the apartheid wall has been diverted, for example, where a village can survive or an area, for some time until one organizes more. But I was wondering about, well, it's more than one question, but just to why did you use the framework of law and legality in the first place? I mean, you talk about why you decided not to, but I was wondering about why originally you were thinking in this framework, and also about, it would be interesting to hear also about the debate in Australia about using this the language of law and legality also within indigenous communities and organizing.
So. I had originally, so when I started thinking and I was reading the Geneva Convention, I was reading the collective punishment, and then I just could not get past the fact that, like you said, talking about how human rights, international law is abused is just, it's almost too obvious. We have been using that like discourse for so long. We've been saying, but look, it's against human rights law, it's against international law. But I think that when I changed, I was saying, okay, why don't we talk about how these laws haven't worked? And sometimes they do, sometimes they're okay. We need to have some sort of law and order, but the law that we're using does not center indigenous sovereignty. It does not center liberation. So I decided against it because I just felt like it was far more interesting to look at why it didn't work, why it will never work, and why we just know that it's just going to fall on top of its head, And the second question about relating to law in Australia. So this is, law in Australia is, in relation to Indigenous sovereignty, is deeply complex, as you can imagine. Before 1967, I mentioned the referendum that happened, which received a big and like 97% yes vote by the white Australian population, who said that that Aboriginal peoples should be recognised by the state, by the Commonwealth government, and not state control. So prior to 1967, Aboriginal people were under the laws of the state governments, and each state had different laws regarding their Aboriginal population, right? And often there were, divided pools, like apartheid pools, apartheid cinemas, everything. And so this push to say, okay, well, Aboriginal people can be represented by the nation, just like, the settler population, received a massive massive yes vote. But what happened as a result of this, what was perceived as a successful thing, was the reserves that had hosted Aboriginal people before, where they had been living for generations. And we actually were speaking a little bit about this earlier, like what happens next. These reserves shut down. The state went, okay, I'm not responsible anymore. It's the nation's problem. And there was mass migration of Aboriginal populations to the cities to find employment. And then what happened was there was mass brutality, police brutality. There was increased Indigenous representation in prisons, because the system just will continue to find a way to eliminate the Indigenous population, because like I said earlier, its entire design is for native elimination. So whether or not we have these sort of like treaties, for example, which is something that's being debated at the moment in Victoria, which is problematic itself because the Aboriginal people that live in Victoria, knowing that there are 500 nations of Aboriginal people, there's all of a sudden, because of the state, a new category of Aboriginal people that are called Victorian Aboriginals. So they're defined within the borders of the state rather than existing to a pre-colonial Australia. So this treaty is, really problematic. There's something else, these constant projects that perpetually divide Indigenous peoples rather than making these sort of pan-Aboriginal movements. So, yeah, law in Australia. Then, there's so many other things we can talk about, like native title that happened, which, is something that it will be too long to talk about, but essentially divided Aboriginal people, fractured Aboriginal people, and one of the biggest pushes in the 1960s and 70s was the pan-Aboriginal movement, that all Aboriginal people were together. The government has just separated that. And then they do these performative, effective, reconciliation things where they say, sorry, without any land, without any law, So this is why, law it can't, unless it centers Indigenous sovereignty, it won't work. In fact, this is actually something, I'll finish, I'm sorry, but there is a woman, Sarah Madison, she's a settler Australian, a white woman, and she says, white Australia needs to stop saying that they have the solution for Aboriginal problems because they need to recognise they are the problem, period. White Australia, this is the name of her book, White Australia can't solve black problems, period, So yeah, that was sort of the reason that like international law, it's like, I can't, I can't.
But then how does aesthetics, how does it, through aesthetics, looking at those two videos, but also in general for you, how does it take you away from speaking within the structure of law and legality and the borders of the nation state and all of this? I was thinking a lot about it, while you were speaking, that perhaps also there's something about art and aesthetics that completely makes, the present regime, obsolete, right? It completely freezes these law and legality, right? There's something that about, certain projects, right? Which completely makes the legal obsolete and does not compromise. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe perhaps you can speak a bit more generally about it, and then how it also kind of plays out in the work of Larissa and.
I have something else coming to my mind that I should have spoken about,
Please.
perhaps, but. I think, again, we mentioned this earlier a little bit, that art, and I mentioned it in the talk, is such a fantastic place to experiment, right, with future liberation that are outside of the legal confines that we find ourselves in. And I think that this is what Larissa does. Well, Larissa does it in a very cynical way and in a very, I think, sad and tragic way, using the same sort of techniques of the colonizer. And Bronte just sort of celebrates Aboriginal women. So there's two separate ways of doing it. There's two different forms of resistance. There's sort of like trying to figure out how there's going to be a way for a de facto state on one hand, and then the other one, which is more centering Indigenous sovereignty through connection to land and to country, that just don't exist within the confines of law. It just proves how much, it proves how that law is just a fiction. It's just a fiction. That's what they underscore. They say law is, something that you can just, you have to play with, you have to manipulate. But there's a work that I'm thinking of in a way that sort of really, and it's a connection between Australia and Palestine. It's the work of Tom Nicholson, who I'm not sure if you are familiar with, who did this photographic series of these monuments where Australia was in Palestine in 1917, and we have these monuments in Australia that celebrate soldiers that went to war, and it has France. Australia was in France. Australia was in Gallipoli, and we have all of these monuments that say Palestine. Australia was in Palestine, right? And then what happened? This is something that I feel like art can really emphasize what's going on, the perversities of law and diplomacy. Is in 2017, when it was the 100-year celebration of Australia being in Palestine, the Prime Minister went and celebrated with Netanyahu. I think it was Netanyahu. I mean, this is crazy, you know? He went and celebrated, and then the most perverse thing of the whole project was that he brought the Prime Minister of Australia brought 2 Aboriginal soldiers with him. I mean, this is what is this, and so Tom's work just says, this is a lie. This is a lie. Look at what is happening, and the way, so I think this is how art and aesthetics can really just put to that. But again, something that's great is like film and photography. These are, again, forms of documentation that creates alternative histories and counter histories and counter futures. But yeah, I'm pessimistic. I'm a little bit. I'm trying not to be too optimistic about that. Yeah.
Just to go back to maybe because you look at sovereignty in a little bit in the legal kind of framework, but then you try to redefine indigenous sovereignty through looking at the works. Yeah. Right. And of course it's extremely difficult, right? Not to capture only what sovereignty is, but to you were saying that, you know, it's a struggle for you to refute you know, indigenous thinkers about sovereignty. You know, perhaps you can talk a little bit about that. But I also you mentioned, I think, in talking about Bronte's work, you mentioned that sovereignty is in ummah, in in language, which I thought was extremely interesting. Right, at some point that sovereignty becomes within language itself, right? The claim, but also you speak about. And this is where I'm a bit suspicious. But you speak about sovereignty and the relationship between body and land in indigenous communities or native communities. And you know, I was thinking about this great text by Jimmy Durham, who's a Native American Cherokee artist, who says that this discourse about the natives' relationship to land as a natural kind of relationship that preceded the colonizer is also a discourse that is invented by colonialism, right? That this romanticization, but also even the binary of nature culture, right? It's also within this discourse, and you also speak about this in terms of in relation to Bronte's work. So yeah, I wanted to just maybe you can elaborate more about this question of sovereignty and in relation to Bronte's work and land, right?
So I refer a lot to the theorist and Professor Aileen Morton Robinson, who's an Indigenous scholar from Quandamooka country, which is the north of Australia on an island just off Brisbane, who defines Indigenous sovereignty in opposition to Western sovereignty. And she says Indigenous sovereignty is ontological. It's the way that we experience the land, and it's our being, it's the land is like, you know, ancestors, the plants, the waterways, everything exists together. It's the sense of belonging, right? And the opposition to that is Western sovereignty, which is possession and borders and having a sovereign. And in Bronte's work, she represents sovereign women. This is, again, something that Tracy Bunda has spoken about, and Morton Robinson, this idea of sovereign women who claim their sovereignty, who say that I'm connected to my country, I have a community that has, it's this idea of like, the community has, it's not they define, you don't define your sovereignty, the community defines your sovereignty, it's where you belong. But yeah, this can be problematic because Western sovereignty just bulldozes everything. So on one hand, you know, this discourse, you know, it's a discussion that I've been having with somebody called Professor Gary Foley, and we've been talking about how sovereignty can't be ceded, which is what Aileen Morton Robinson says. So it can't be ceded, but it can be completely destroyed. And so there's, again, this tragedy. I think with Bronte's work, yeah, they say, the women say, I am Amma, and welcome to the Amma, which is, I think, this talking about sovereign place and sovereign identity that I think is quite unique to, yeah, Indigenous sovereignty. But, yeah.
You know, because this, again, just to ponder a bit more,
Yeah.
I mean, because, I mean, I see that, you know, I see also Bronte's work as an invitation to think through these, you know, these issues. But I was thinking about the immigrant, right, in terms of if this, you know, if it's the native's relationship to land, it's natural. It's a natural connection that it's already exists before. Then what happens to the immigrant, right? And so, you know, it's really, or to the refugee, right?
Absolutely.
So it really becomes, you know, problematic. But at the same time, you know, the native has a claim to land, and how do you forge it? But it is about the discourse, right?
Yeah, there's, again, I keep like pulling up theorists, but Lorenzo Veracini, he's an Australian, Italian theorist of settler colonial theory, who says that the difference between the invader and the settler, the white settler, for example, is that they bring their sovereignty with them. They have this claim of sovereignty, that they have this perceived right to be there. And the migrant or the asylum seeker does not bring their sovereignty with them. They come with nothing. They say, I am going to absorb, and I'm going to be absorbed within this already sovereign structure.
But they become like the native, in a sense, right? The immigrant and the native,
well,
they're pushed out by the nation state, right? The sovereign...
it's this like process of elimination, who's considered in and who's considered out. This is what happens, especially in Australia as well. Like, this is something that, you know, you just, it's palpable when you're there. You just know it's so divided. Communities of people are separated. There are movements and people, you know, live together and it's okay. But yeah, there's this, you know, I always say this, like the first law of Australia was the White Australia policy that was designed to prevent non-white people from coming. This was the first law, 1901. What happened? We make a country. Let's make the first law that we can make it really hard for anybody of color, anybody that's not white, to come here. So this is embedded in the entire, you know, nation. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, this is now this question of the nation state, right? This dilemma.
Yeah.
And you mentioned also that one way out of thinking through the nation state, which you know, you're either in or out, and works with these binaries, is through thinking with transnationalism, right? But the question is, you know, how do you see it within the two works? But also, my question is about transnationalism. Is that the problem with it is that you already have citizens that have privileges and power within their nation states, right? So how can they come together equally, right, in this transnational, forming this transnational community in a sense? And how do you see this forging of transnationality in the two works?
I'm sorry, allow me to interrupt for a second. Maybe somebody from the audience as well has questions if you guys want to engage them as well.
And then we open it to the
Great,
floor.
thank
Absolutely,
yeah, the transnational format of resistance, I think, is, a methodological practice of especially for me in the academy. We need to think about the transnational struggles, multiple struggles that are happening. But then there's also transnationality within. This is something that's interesting as well. Like there are multiple Aboriginal nations, so this is a transnational state. But I mean, yeah, we were saying boycott, for example. Boycott's a good way of thinking about transnational resistance, transnational solidarity, and how citizens within an international and I was saying that boycott is a transnational movement rather than an international movement. Yeah, in the works, I think that Bronte does this by just saying, well, the nation state, Hannah Bronte doesn't even call herself, she says, I'm not Australian, I don't identify within these paradigms. So I think that the nation state is just a problematic structure that we just stick to, but we need to just dislocate ourselves from it and think about alternative models. It's hard to come up with models. I don't know.
No, absolutely. But artists are always, there's a struggle, but being curators as well, it's always this struggle against a fixed national identity, right? Totally. There's always a problem when you list artists' names. They don't want their nationality to be mentioned.
This is changing in Australia, yeah.
But institutions are always, because, institutions are also not only part, but also copies structurally of the state. So there's always this struggle, right? The artist doesn't want to be kind of rigidly their identity being defined by the institution. The artist is always saying, don't mention my nationality, don't mention my gender, don't mention, right? So they want to slip away from these identities.
Yeah, but the question is whether or not it's good that the state institution does that, or any institution. But it's still the institution. It's still unstolen land. Okay, in Australia you put down the country from which an Aboriginal person comes, but it's still exhibited in the Australian National Gallery. So it's again, we were talking about the impasse, what happens? How do we imagine decolonisation in the settler state? Yeah, but...
There's this, one last thing, and when we open it, there's this museum in Jerusalem called the Museum on the Seam, and it's an Israeli museum, but it's on the on the Green Line, and exactly the Baramki house, exactly, and they love to invite Palestinian and Arab artists to participate in their shows, and of course most of the artists reject their invitations. But I heard about this artist who accepted the invitation once and said that, okay, I will send you a proposal, right? And the proposal that she sent was the work of art was to give back the house to the Baramki family, right? And of course, it is the destruction. In a sense, it is the actual destruction of the institution. So the institution of the state, right? It would have to stop being a museum and go back to being a Palestinian house, right? It goes back to its rightful owners. So,
that's an
amazing,
that's an amazing work. Wow.
Sorry. So we open it. I'm sure many have many questions.
Kind of wasn't able to understand what do you mean by indigenous sovereignty. So can you explain more? What do you mean? I imagine it like in the context of Palestine. Do you mean Palestinians are for the Indonesians, therefore we have to rule over those who are non-Indonesians, the Israelis? Is that what you mean, or in your view of like kind of decolonization, in which there will not be a state nation, therefore it would look something different? If yes, how it would look like, the sovereignty of the indigenous people?
Yeah, so Indigenous sovereignty, I don't define because I'm not Indigenous, but it's been defined by an Indigenous woman as ontological, which, you know, I spoke about before, this connection to country, the way that, you know, people have been living there for thousands and thousands of years, the connection to the waterways, to the sky, to the sea. This is Indigenous sovereignty. As a format of if we don't accept the modern nation, well, the modern nation state as a sovereign format, what alternatives can we have? I think it will have a completely different format. It won't look like the nation state. But we were all discussing earlier about the problem of how I could propose an alternative solution, especially as a non-Indigenous person. It would be a colonial, you know, it would be a continuation of colonial mentality if I were to say, okay, well, like, this is what should happen, you know?
Who's Indigenous and where are you Indigenous?
Like me personally? Yeah, I mean, this is a very, yeah.
There's a lot of questions. Are Arabs Indigenous? There's a lot of questions that we can't follow up into.
Yeah.
Indigenous, because it's hard. There's a Syrian live here, there's Iraq, there's the line of Kurds and stuff. So I know you are not a politician, you're not a scientist, but
Yeah, no, I think it's...
many questions for me that it's unsolved, but just
But this is, I think this is also what I was speaking about when I was speaking about that it's also a colonial discourse, this romanticization of the relationship between the native and the land, right? Who's indigenous, right? You know, we have capitalist Palestinians who have no relationship whatsoever with land in the way that we can, you know, you imagine an indigenous relation, or, you know, a relationship with integrity, right? So perhaps, I mean, but also we should be careful about who is native and who is, in a sense, who's a settler, right? But it's also maybe it's our relationship to the nation state that perhaps, or right, that decides it. How you are pushed, right? You're pushed away. So as an immigrant, as an indigenous, as a, you know, native inhabitant, right? But you can be also pushed out of your land by Palestinian capitalists, right?
Yeah, it's the
right?
system.
I mean,
it's the
so it's also once you add in class and right, it becomes more complex. But again, one should also be careful about you know, who is the settler and who is the native, and that it should always, these relationships of power should always be clear.
Yeah. I think also one thing that's really interesting about Australia is that, like, the whole nation was built for, like, white belonging, right? So I'm 5th generation Australian. Like, my family came there quite early on in the project. They had their boat from from England, and they went across to get land, you know? And the whole project was made for me to feel as though life is good there, and not to interrogate, you know, too much about the structure, because I've been, you know, afforded so many privileges by the entire system, you know, and but this also complicates where I belong as well, because, you know, as soon as you've been living there for 5 generations, like, you have an Australian passport, but you're not Indigenous. You're not from that land. You know, it's this colonial project that continues. Yeah.
Please, George.
Post-colonial experiments like South Africa as it relates to the discussion you had earlier about not using a legal framework and using a visual art, post-colonial, and the other thing, to me, it seems like when it comes to South Africa, it wasn't the legality, it was the leverage that ended the colonial project. Doesn't matter what the legality was.
Yeah. So I definitely do not know enough about South Africa to answer that in the way that, you know, I possibly, you know, you'd possibly like. But I think that, yeah, leverage, absolutely. This is why boycott's important, you know. I'm not, were you even there the other day when we're having this conversation about, like, America turning off the tap of money? You know, this is why boycott needs to be targeted towards nation states so that there becomes more leverage. This is, yeah. But regarding South Africa, I can't make a comment on it. I couldn't. Yeah.
Okay, let's take two questions together. Maybe it's easier for you to answer more.
Thank you so much for this discussion. It's so rich. To go back to this question, though, about land and indigenous sovereignty, it is a curious one then of, you know, what are the grammars? What are the possible grammars for thinking about indigenous sovereignty and land that don't reproduce this kind of primordial, you know, and kind of colonial fantasy, right, of land and nature, and I'm just wondering if you have thoughts then on other grammars for articulating, you know, what is an important relationship, the ontological relationship to land as a claim to sovereignty, but, you know, what are those, what are the grammars? What are the alternatives?
Well, yeah, that's very, yeah, I think that it's probably important to emphasize the romanticization that can happen, like with Jimmy Durham's talking about this idea of, like, native connection to land. This is something that definitely happens in Australia. There's, like, this notion of indigenous connection to country is a performative one. You know, it's just this, you know, there's a work by Richard Bell who says, like, he goes and he asks white Australians what they think that Aboriginal people contribute to Australia, and he says culture. They all say, like, culture, you know, the culture. So there's this idea of connection to country being one of yeah, this sort of romanticized image. But yeah, alternatives to indigenous sovereignty. Is that
Maybe like an alternative calculus or something for thinking about land and sovereignty.
That's more like inclusive and maybe like.
Because I think the other thing maybe we run into is that what do we mean when we talk about land, right? It can take on so many different conceptions. So, you know, when I talk about it with students in the classroom, some of them talk really about it in secular terms, and it's about property. It's about returning to property or having reimbursement, financial compensation for property, right? And so it makes me wonder about the ontological relationship to land as well, and what are the grammars that are circulating? But maybe Lara, maybe you have thoughts on this too.
I mean, just to add to what you're saying, you know, the typical kind of Palestinian reminiscence about you know, pre-48 is, my God, our family had acres of orange groves, you know, and this is, you know, class. It's you know, this is your claim to pre-48, right? It's land possession, and indeed, I mean, you know, you could go back also to land possession, but it's not about returning to a forged relationship in the past also, right? Perhaps it's about your relationship right now, right? Where you're being dispossessed of not only, you know, land, but family and friends and, you know, of your whole kind of environment, whether natural or cultural, right? In a sense. But because there was this a little bit of discussion of this, you know, historical, right, proving your belonging, using this historical narrative, right, the burying of artifacts, of fake artifacts in Larissa Sansour's work. And I was actually thinking about it, but I'm not sure this answers your question. But about, you know, this kind of dilemma now with museum building, right? That we need to build museums in order to be recognized, you know, as Palestinians, but also, in a sense, by exposing material culture from our struggle, we are also saying that it has ended, or the nature, this kind of struggle has ended, mainly armed struggle, and you know, the history of the revolution, right, is in Yasser Arafat Museum, is in different museums. And I always thought that, okay, there's this problem with exhibition and exposure, right? This announcement of death of the struggle, right? Inside the museum, while right outside it continues the struggle for liberation and emancipation. But burial could be an interesting kind of, you know, act to think about, right? Burial in the land. Perhaps I end it with another anecdote where there's this a Palestinian political prisoner in prison, and he calls his father, you know, with assembled phones from here and there. He calls his father and asks him how he's doing, and his father says, you know, it's really difficult. You know, how are you? And he says, you know, Father, I want you to take care. I want you to be careful because I buried some documents that can implicate me and colleagues and comrades in the land. And take care. Please, you know, remove them, change their location. And the father says, "Are you crazy? You're telling me by phone?" He says, "Goodbye." He calls him in a few more days, and he says, "So how are you, Father? You know, how are you doing?" He says, "It's amazing. You know, when you called, I wanted to tell you about how, you know, there's, you know, our land. I couldn't
Plow.
Exactly,
Yeah,
plow.
yeah.
You know, plow the land. It's plowing season, and I couldn't plow it. And the next day, the Israeli military turns up, and they plow the land, right, for us. It's amazing. Right? So it's free of charge, because his son is in prison. He can't help him, and so it's right. This again. This is about burial, but about the myths of burial, but not actual burial also. In relation to resistance as well, but that it's ongoing, right?
Yeah. This burial's very interesting. There's this case, relating to museums as well, the Jara baby, which was this baby that was that died. Maybe like 100 years ago, well, more than 100 years ago now. But the colonizers took it, they found it in a tree, and it had ochre on it, and it had been wrapped up in possum skin. So it was obviously a very special baby. The museum took it and kept it for 99 years until there was a declaration by the Jajawarong community who said, we want the Jara baby back, we need to bury it on country, it needs to be, we need to, you know, finish the ceremony that you stopped us from completing. And the Melbourne Museum asked to have it for one more year so that they could celebrate 100 years of having it. And the Jajawarong were like, no, you give it back now. We have this declaration. Let me see what you've done. You've had it for 99 years. Let us see what you have written in this time. You want to take 1 year so you can celebrate 100 years and do some more research that you've had 99 years to do. And they could only produce 11 pages. That's all they had done in the 99 years that they had it. And then they said, oh, please let us have it for 1 more year. So, I mean, yeah, and it was returned and it was buried properly by the Judge Awarung. But burial, very interesting, this maybe in relation to ontology, connection to country and land, and how we use land, especially in relation to the environment as well. This is a big thing. But yeah, very interesting. Yeah.
I'd like to thank you for the interesting lecture. I'd like to comment on the concept of the relationship between the indigenous population and land and the meaning of that in a way. The way that we talk about land, this relationship sounds like a timeless concept in a way. And the definition of indigenous population, as my friend here commented on that, it's not clear. And I think that the relationship is dynamic all the time. And we have to distinguish between the concept of land and space and time-space. Now, time-space is a whole concept in physics. As per Einstein, it's one construct. It's not like time and space are not disconnected. They're not different concepts. So they're one construct. And so the relationship between biological entities, which is humans, animals, what have you, with land, is a dynamical relationship. Per physics, biology, and evolutionary biology, even let's say humans went through evolution of some sort through external interventions or factors. So I'd like you to comment on that and how does this relate to this whole narrative, I would say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe we take another
Yes,
question.
take another.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk and for the commentary and the interlocutor's intervention. Just to add to that and maybe to also give a bit of a take on this, I think it's really important not to just dismiss the whole idea that there is no indigenous relationship to land. I think that can be very problematic and can collapse and actually simplify and erase very important relationships that we need to look at. I think in Palestine also, there are non-propertied relationships to land. They're not organized around possession and capitalist modes of possession. Before 1948, half of Palestinian villages were organized along Masha' lines, were collectively organized, were managed collectively. And that's a non-propertied capitalist notion. And so it's important to recover and reclaim that. A decolonizing project actually needs to look at those histories and those concepts and relationships and try to understand them on their own terms.
Definitely.
So that's one. And I think that in relationship to the question that Shaira had asked, I think it's not just about, I think if you go to Palestinian frontline places today where there is an attempt to remain on the land, people are really struggling and fighting to remain in the midst of, settler violence and targeting, etc. There is an understanding that land is a being, and there is a relationship and ethics and a different way of conceptualizing and relating to land, but without trying to romanticize that. But I also think that there are deep place-based knowledges and histories.
Absolutely.
And that's also part of trying to understand and recover what is indigenous sovereignty, what are the notions that are actually erased by the settler project, the settler state. And so I think that there's actually a lot for us to think about as Palestinians and to begin to look into, and knowledges that we can begin to explore and recover and reclaim. So if you want to comment on that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. These models of knowledge, that's this epistemic question of belonging. This is why, Morton Robinson says that sovereignty is not only ontological but epistemological. It's been the way that land has been experienced, the way in which people have lived in land, the knowledge that comes from this existence. And and the first question relating, hang on, now I forgot. Can you just remind me what was?
About Masha', about the commune, pre-48, to look at also instances where there's a different relationship, not a property, possession, relationship of possession. Masha' is communal land ownership, collective ownership of land.
This is what's happening in Australia. Is there is the call for like centering Indigenous sovereignty, which means that sovereign Aboriginal people will decide how they experience land, which would be based on pre-colonial sort of spaces. But at the same time, like you said, there are people who want to exploit land for capital gain anyway. So there's class and the class and capitalism that comes into it, despite ontological connection to land, despite sovereign connection to land. So there's a constantly conflict between, you know, sovereignty. Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't agree more, but it's really important, again, not to romanticize it and look at it also in a kind of as a, I mean, as a relationship that's its basis is also material, right? It's a relationship between land and people. You depend on land, and land, in a sense, depends on you, right? As well, it's reciprocal. I actually was thinking of Jomana Emil Aboud's project in relation to what you were saying, because you know, Jomana has been looking at water springs in Palestine, and looking at all of these stories that have to do with water springs. She goes back to, you know, 48 territories and tries to find water springs that have been mentioned and stories around them, and she kind of brings back the stories, hoping for us to really actually go to the sites themselves. So and you know, with it, all this knowledge about the plants that grow around the water spring, all of these stories, magical creatures, but that are born out of this of the use of the land and yeah, this relationship. Yeah. And in terms of the Masha as well, I mean, even we can think of the refugee camp as a a present form also of the commune and the Masha. Absolutely, totally.
Okay, I want to thank you so much, Lara and Suzannah, for such a wonderful discussion. Thank you as well for coming. I know this is one of non-ending conversations that we can keep going.
Yeah, we could go on
anyway,
for a long time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming as well. Shukran.